Just want to say for those of us that are local today, welcome to the best day of the week. And it's always a blessing to be together on the Lord's Day, and we have people from distances who listen at different times, and welcome you to our class today. Sometimes because we're 2,000 years away, we have certain images, certain pictures of our biblical characters. And one of the things, and there's a lot more than just what we're going to touch on today, but one of the things that just kind of keeps coming back to my mind, especially when I read this part of Acts and 1 Corinthians, Paul just makes this statement, I was with you in weakness, in fear, and much trembling. That's typically not the picture that we have of Paul, right? And if you just were going to just give some either synonyms or descriptions, and when you think of Paul, you think of, and various things would come to mind. And I think this is very important, and to me it's kind of like an anchor passage for the Corinthian correspondence. And there were a number of reasons that contributed to that, but he didn't stride into Corinth as a triumphant conqueror. And in fact, as he will start talking in 2 Corinthians, there are any number of criticisms of Paul, which we're only going to touch on a couple today. And there were some very serious opposition. There were people who were actively working against him and what he was doing. And Paul makes this statement that is an inside out. It's kind of a backward type thing until you kind of come to think about it. And he simply will say, when I am weak, then I am strong. And in my mind, I kind of say, in the Lord. And what is to me significant about both what we're going to look at today and the Corinthian correspondence is that my expression is, I think of here's the Las Vegas of the ancient world. Kind of what Sodom and Gomorrah was in the Old Testament, that's what Corinth was. And if there was ever a place that needed the Lord's church, it was Corinth. But I'm also reminded, as we kind of come back to this from last week, God tells Paul, speak up, don't be afraid. And then here comes this wonderful expression, I have many people in this city. And that to me is such an important reminder, and to me it says, if God had people in Corinth, God has people any and everywhere. And at the beginning of each of Paul's letters, he will say something significant about God. And in 1 Corinthians, it's God is faithful. And there's so many different qualities, so many different characteristics of God. But God is faithful. And then later in chapter 10, to these Corinthian Christians, he will say, God is faithful. And in Corinth, no temptation has taken you but such as common to men. And in Corinth, God will find a way of escape. And you just stop and think, if you are a Christian in Corinth, how many day-to-day temptations are you going to have to deal with? And so, while we're not going to do very much from the letter, we'll touch on a couple of things. Dr. Luke then gives us several descriptions of what took place while Paul is there. I thought it'd be interesting also just to start and look at a contrast. He has left Athens, and as we said last week, Paul is accustomed to being persecuted, beaten, stoned, you name it. And in Athens, they just kind of yawn and ignore him in general. But notice the contrast. Athens was the cultural center of the Greco-Roman world, and he's moving to Corinth, 40 miles away, which is going to be kind of the political and military capital of Greece. There may have been one, but there's no mention of a synagogue in Athens. And Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed in the Lord and together with his entire household. And a part of what's going to take place, and you just kind of stop and think about this, the ruler of the synagogue becomes a Christian and immediately ceases to be the ruler of the synagogue. He lost, well, we don't know what all he lost, but I'm sure he had a lot of opposition, in fact, some type of persecution. And for the ruler of the synagogue, kind of like the elder, the organizer of the synagogue, to become a Christian would have just been kind of an earth-shaking event within the Jewish circles. And a part of the reason why Paul is going to be drug into court is going to be because of the loss that took place. Athens, Paul is there for a short time. And with the extended visits both of Timothy and some of his other workers, Paul is going to stay in the city of Corinth for a year and 6 months. The only other place that he stays longer is that there's a reference to him being in Ephesus for 3 years. And we'll anticipate this next week. But as you look at Athens and Corinth and across the Aegean Sea into Asia Minor, Athens, Corinth, and Ephesus were the major cities of that part of the Greek world, and Paul is going to spend more time there than any other place during his ministry. There is no record of a church meeting in Athens. We have 1st and 2nd Corinthians. There's no record of Paul returning to Athens, as he's typically going to do, to go back to visit and encourage the churches where he's been. And Corinth is going to become the center, and the same thing coming with Ephesus. And if Paul stays in one of these industrial, commercial places where a lot of people are coming and going, then people become Christians while they're there, other Christians come. And this still is amazing to me. When you read Romans chapter 16, Paul has yet to be to the city of Rome when he writes the book of Romans, and he is going to list 35 people by name, either in Rome or that he knows in that correspondence. And you stop and think, if you haven't visited a church personally, but you can list 35 people who are associated with the church, you know a great deal about that congregation, even though you physically haven't been there. And so this is the result of Paul being in these major commercial, political, cultural areas, and with the travel that took place and all the things that are going on, then it also puts him in touch with a large number of people. We also have no record of co-workers returning to Athens, and we're going to find in 1 Corinthians 4:17, I sent to you Timothy, and these wonderful terms, beloved and faithful. Paul is going to have Erastus to remain at Corinth, and then we find that he is going to actually send Timothy and some others. And so there's a constant flow of people coming and going from the church of Corinth, but that was not the case with the church in Athens. When we come to chapter 18, there's three, and a writer used this term, kind of three major pronouncements, kind of three statements that are made or kind of define this chapter. And the first one is, after Paul has gone into the synagogue and being rejected, this whole symbolic gesture of shaking the dust off your feet, maybe even the dust off of your garments, and basically saying, to some extent or another, your blood is on your own hands, I've done my part. If you reject this message, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. And Paul is going to do that in many different places, but he always goes to the synagogue first. And not only do you have the possibility, like in the case in Corinth, of Christmas becoming a Christian, I think it's also especially the God-fearers. And we used that expression earlier. There were people who were not Jews, and in many cases for the men had not been circumcised, and yet they would worship in the synagogue on the Saturday, on the Sabbath. They followed a lot of the Jewish teachings, a lot of the influence, and I doubt this was true in every case, but I have read a record where one of the Jewish rabbis said, if you are faithful to the 10th generation, then you can pray, O God of our father Abraham. Well, that's a long time to wait to become a full-fledged member of a particular group. 10th generation. And then someone like Paul comes in and preaches the gospel, and if you're baptized, you become a full-fledged member of the family of God today. And so a part of Paul always going to the synagogue is, yes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, but especially those wonderful people who were the God-fearers that were there. The second major affirmation, and we touched on this last week again, is this vision. And unless Paul was afraid, why would you tell him don't be afraid? And you see his comment, I came to you with much fear and trembling. And the vision says, and listen very carefully, do not be afraid, but go on speaking, do not be silent. I am with you, and no one will attack you to harm you. I don't know if any of us can just properly conceive of being beaten because we teach something about Christianity, much less being stoned. And for those of us, thankfully, who've never had to deal with that, sorry, the only expression, there's a farming term called gun shy, where like you have dogs and they're shy of guns or everything, and you'd get a little gun shy going into a new town if continually you keep getting beaten and stoned and all these other things. And among other reasons, Paul comes to Corinth with this much fear and trembling, and the second declaration is, don't be afraid. Fear can cause all of us to either do things we shouldn't do sometimes or not do things that we should. And I was in a chapel service once, and I just take the man at his word, but he just said one of the most constant affirmations all the way through Scripture is either don't be afraid or something like be of good cheer or be strong. And you'll have an angel appear to someone, and yes, we would be startled and frightened, and the voice will say, now don't be afraid. And even someone like Paul at times would just deal with personal matters that caused a sense of fear, and fear could maybe bring about paralysis. He might not do the things that he should. And here's this very specific vision. Don't be afraid. Keep on speaking. And there's this assurance that what you have suffered recently in the past is not going to happen here. And then here's my favorite line in the whole thing. I have many people in this city. And that's something that just always echoes with me. I have many people in the Sodom and Gomorrah of the first century in this city. And if you will speak up, if you will not be afraid, then let me say it this way. I listened to an older missionary who had established several churches, and he just simply said, when I go to a new city or I go to a new place, I don't think I'm going to go and I'm going to preach the gospel and I'm going to convert people. He said, my prayer is, God, help me work with the people that you were working with before I ever came here. That's a big difference than, oh, I'm going to preach and I'm going to start this church. And his thought was, like what Paul says here, in any given place, God is already working in people and with people and through people in ways that we don't know. And his prayer would be, God, help me to work with you, with the people that you have in this particular city. And especially said of Corinth, that to me is just an amazing thing. The third one, and we're going to touch on this in some different ways, Gallio, the proconsul, will not even hear the charges brought against Paul. And when he finds out that it's matters of Jewish principle and Jewish law, he just stops all the proceedings and he just simply says, I refuse to be a judge of these things. And he drove them from the tribunal, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. One last thing in terms of review, because we never have exactly the same people in each class. These two events are very, very central. One, Priscilla and Aquila are driven out of Rome, and Claudius makes a decree that the Jews should leave Rome, and that's going to be 49 AD. And then there's actually been an inscription, a stone inscription found in Ephesus, that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia in July of 51. And those two events are very significant because the dating of the book of Acts and so many other things revolve around those. So we're going to start reading in Acts chapter 18, verse 12, and we'll just read through this section and then have some discussion about things that come up. When Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal, saying, "This man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrongdoing or vicious crimes, O Jews, I would have reason to accept your complaint, but since it is a matter of questions about words and names and your own law, see to that yourselves. I refuse to be a judge of these things." And he drove them from the tribunal. This is crazy. They all seized Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, but Gallio paid no attention to any of this. After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchrea he cut his hair, for he was under a vow, and they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. But he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews, and when they asked him to stay for a longer period, he declined. But taking leave of them, he said, "I will return to you if God wills," and he set sail from Ephesus. So we're now at 1822. When he had landed at Caesarea, so he's going to go all the way back to Palestine, he went up and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch, and after spending some time there, he departed and went from one place to the next, through the regions of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. So we're about to have a transition, technically, in what we call from the second missionary journey to the third. But after Paul leaves Corinth, he leaves Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, makes his way back, and then begins visiting these churches as he's done previously. And I put some of these just kind of in a line. What is significant is that Dr. Luke gives us some very specific characteristics of Apollos. And notice these. A Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, which is in Egypt, came to Ephesus, and look at the list. This one's going to say he was an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and fervent in spirit. He spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he only knew the baptism of John. So just let that sink in again. We're 20 years after the cross, and we're going to see the same thing, Lord willing, in the next chapter. Here are 12 men who 20 years later, for whatever reason, have not heard about the death, burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, but they've been taught, repent, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, prepare you the way of the Lord. They know the teaching of John the Baptist, but 20 years later they have not heard the details about the crucifixion of Jesus yet. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote the disciples to welcome him. So he's going to leave Ephesus, go back to Corinth, and when he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed. He powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the scriptures that Christ was Jesus. So here is an amazing, talented person who is going to become a part of the New Testament church. And in the same way that John the Baptist prepared the way of the Lord physically in his lifetime, his teaching is still preparing the way of the Lord 20 years later. And this Apollos then is contacted, met, taught by Priscilla and Aquila. But I want to go back to the ruling of Gallio, and I hadn't really thought about this seriously, but I'm in a Roman history class, and the teacher was just talking about kind of how Rome ruled in the first century. And of all things, one of his examples of Roman rulership in the first century was from Acts chapter 18. So when you look at Gallio, the highest court is obviously going to be in the city of Rome, and that's why Paul is going to say, I appeal to Caesar. But if you're out in the provinces, if you're out in all of the other areas, the next highest ruling would come from the court of a proconsul. And again, quick review. Augustus divided the empire up. He wanted to have control of Egypt. He wanted to have control of Palestine and various places. So if you come across someone as a governor or a prefect, then he is going to answer directly to Caesar. And what is the leverage that the Jews have to get Jesus crucified? If you let this man go, we will tell Caesar you're not his friend. And there had been a Roman official in Egypt in the previous decades who Caesar renounced his friendship, and this man committed suicide rather than going back to Rome and not being Caesar's friend. And so if you come across governor, prefect, he's going to answer to Caesar. However, if you come across the term proconsul, this is typically someone who has been in the Senate for an extended period of time, and he is going to be the ruler of these provinces in order to benefit and help the people who are in the Senate. And we use the example, it would be like sending Teddy Kennedy to England to be the ambassador. You know, having been in the Senate for all those years, he would just know the protocol and things. So if you're out in the provinces and you can get a judicial hearing from a proconsul, that's the closest you're going to get to the Senate without having to go to Rome, and that's why this ruling is so significant. So 1-4, the judgment would carry a lot of weight, and notice what happened. The fact that Gallio will not even hear the case and will drive the people out is an important legal precedent. And here's what I mean by this. The fact that you have a ruling, and rather than dragging Paul in and rather than hearing all the cases, the legal precedent is that Christianity, and this is going to change, at this particular point is not illegal. And this will be the case until Nero will then start blaming Christians as scapegoats for his incompetency. And this term, I refuse to be the judge of these matters, is an important legal precedent. So when you look at Roman numeral 2, through the decades, the Jews had won a hard-fought battle for legal recognition. And when you read the Romans' comments about the Jews, well, let me go back and say it this way. There was no weekend in the ancient world because there was no reason for it. Most Romans worked 7 days a week, and that's why having these holidays, whether it was the emperor's birthday or something, was so important. But the constant comment about the Romans concerning the Jews was they're lazy. Did you know they take Saturday off and don't do any work at all on Saturday? And so when these pagan Romans looked at the Jews observing the Sabbath day, their critique was, oh, these people are lazy. And for the first 3 centuries, no one's going to be taken off on Sunday because Christianity is not an established legal religion until after Constantine in the early 300s or so. So the whole idea of the weekend didn't exist in the ancient world. And so when Romans looked at these odd Jews, who some of them would actually call them atheists because they don't have any statues, and they claim to worship a God that they can't see. And so as the Romans looked at these people, there was always kind of this odd, these people are really kind of queer and weird in some ways. However, the Jews had worked really hard to become recognized within the Roman world as a legal religion. So if you look at 2:3, because of this, the last thing they want to do is share this hard-won privilege with this upcoming group of Christians. And there's a couple of terms here. The Jews were considered religio licita, which is legal religion. In time, and again, with Nero and some other things going into Domitian and in the first century, Christians will be described as religio illicita, meaning illegal religion. And the persecution of Christians, like I said, will begin in the 60s, will be very strong at the end of the first century, and then at various times until the decrees of Constantine, Christians will be persecuted, killed, all kinds of things will happen, but it's under the umbrella that they are an illegal religion. And the Jews were very, very conscious of this and obviously didn't want to share that privilege with them. And the reason I think this is significant is that who's the first reader of Luke and Acts? Oh, most excellent Theophilus. And so here's someone who, in his position, is a person who hears legal proceedings. And Dr. Luke is very specific and very clear, and always the example comes to mind. In Luke 23, then Luke very carefully gives, there were 3 charges brought against Jesus to Pilate. And then he will give 3 different times that Pilate tries to free Jesus. And as you read through Luke and Acts, just notice there's just this thread of legal proceedings that take place all the way through the book. And that precedent would be very, very significant. When you look at the next page, when Paul leaves Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, this wonderful interaction takes place in which they meet this wonderful person called Apollos. And I always love this. They took him aside and explained the way of God more accurately. There's no telling how many people have been taught the gospel in someone's home. And I specifically remember listening to a missionary from New Zealand, and he just said that there are very few public places, and we're talking about everything from pubs to hotels, even to some restaurants. He said there are very few places that you can have both the concentration and the lack of distractions to teach someone. And then here it came, and he said, your home will be the best possible place to teach people the gospel. Invite them in for meals, hospitality, being able to do things. And here's one of these wonderful examples where these 2 godly people, they didn't argue with him in public. They didn't make a scene. You know, how did it happen? Would you like to have a meal? Would you like to come to our house? And in the context of their house, then, and this is how I feel about some of our denominational friends, he had made a wonderful start, and he was nearly there, but he wasn't all the way home yet in terms of his understanding. And that's how I feel about our wonderful friends who've accepted Jesus in their heart. They're so sincere, and they're such wonderful people, and we should just accept that. But when I get a chance to talk with them, I say, well done, because like Apollos, you're well on your way, and here's what the New Testament teaches about how a person becomes a Christian in terms of the nature of an adult believing and confessing and being baptized. And Apollos then was brought into their home, enjoyed the fellowship, the time there. But notice what Luke says. They taught him the way of the Lord more accurately. And that to me is such a significant event that's going to take place. So I want to go back to Paul just for a second. We mentioned this. He went to Caesarea, and this is going to be the port city. He will greet the church. He will go to Antioch. He will spend time doing this. And the first thing I want us just to kind of notice about this whole event, and we started with this, I'm struggling for how to say this, so just kind of help me as I try to do this. 2,000 years later, it's helpful for me to see someone who is struggling in his own time, in his own way, to do the things that God's asking him to do. Because we can look at, at Joshua, we can look at a Daniel, we can look at an Abraham and a Paul. And I listened to an older preacher talk about the inspiration of the Bible, and he said, one of the reasons I know the Bible's inspired is that it doesn't candy coat the struggles and the failure, the human side of people who it gives the descriptions of. And so, in its own way, it's kind of encouraging to me that Paul is going to be a person who's going to be struggling with fear, struggling with doubt, and even you're going to hear Jesus say, take this cup from me. And as he comes from Athens into Corinth, there's a lot of pressure on him, and the call is, don't be afraid. My dad would say, step to the plate. Don't be afraid. Keep on speaking, and this is something that he was called to do. When you look at the Corinthians are going to be divided between Cephas, Apollos, and Paul. And one of the things that Paul is going to say, and this is the very bottom, I didn't come to you proclaiming the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. And if you'll turn to the back page, we'll do these quickly. Notice these terms about Apollos, and I'll give you the contrast from the beginning. Virtually everything that Apollos is, Paul isn't. And notice, eloquent, so he's learned and cultured. He's competent, powerful in the Scriptures. The word fervent in Scripture is the word boil. This is not my temperament. I love to listen to preachers who just kind of burn the house down. That's just not me. I've never yelled at my kids. I've spoken softly to them several times, but I love to listen to a guy who just really goes at it. And for those people who enjoyed that, when it was time for Apollos to preach, it was like, we're going to have a real preacher today. And this term boil is just this fervency that's going to be there. He spoke the word accurately, so he's carefully, well-spoken. He speaks boldly. He's going to help the people who had grace. He will powerfully refute the Jews, showing by Scriptures. And then here's the contrast. And we touched on this last week, but just notice where this looks in terms of the opposite. When you read 2 Corinthians 10 and 10, some people are going to say about Paul, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is of no account. He carried a heap big stick when out of town, but he's a real weakling when he's here. And so, because of the background and the culture and the education of Apollos, there's a whole group of people who, when Apollos is speaking in Corinth, they're kind of going, we're going to have a real sermon today. And then when they find out Paul's preaching, they're going to say, I hope we don't have any visitors today. Paul's preaching. I'm sure, and because we're all different, there are some people when they get an outline and they look at it and the first thing they say is, Tim's not preaching today. And that's just a part of life. The first guy I worked with was a prince of a guy, retired military, you'd never know it. And he said, son, when it comes time for you to leave a church and you finally make the announcement, he said, some people are going to clap and some people are going to cry. He said, some people will say, there is a God in heaven, yes. And then some people are going to cry. And he said, that's just human nature, and if you can't deal with that on both sides, don't ever go into preaching. Well, here are these two guys. My dad would call them cats of different colors. Totally different in presentation. And what's Paul? The tent maker, the leather worker, the guy with calluses on his hands. And who's Apollos? He has that really nice presentation. It sounds good, and everything about him just rings in a really important way. So that's 2 Corinthians 10 and 10. And notice these translations. Letters are weighty and forceful. He's unimpressive. His speaking amounts to nothing. His speech is contemptible. And then here's the term in 2 Corinthians 11 and 6. And we just mentioned this last week, but this is where this fits together. Even if I am unskilled in speaking, I am not so in knowledge. And unskilled is spelled I-D-I-O-T-E-S. Let me spell it again. The word unskilled in speaking is spelled I-D-I-O-T-E-S. Idiotes is someone who's an amateur when you expect someone better. This is a little bit of a confession. I enjoy sometimes listening to karaoke because sometimes they're really, really good. And sometimes they're not so good. And so for some of the Corinthians, Paul is like the karaoke guy, compared to Apollos, who is polished and educated and well-spoken, and we just kind of sit there and listen and think, something as important as the Scriptures should be said in such an impressive way, and then this unskilled tent maker gets up, and we kind of feel like, oh, Paul's speaking today. Look at the contrast. But here's the point. Both in terms of leaders and preachers, preachers will either complement each other or they will compete with each other. And what's instructive is that Paul never competes with Apollos. Paul never draws a negative comparison about him. And look at these verses from 1 Corinthians 3, 4, and 6. Some say, I follow Paul. Another, I follow Apollos. Are you human? What is Apollos? What is Paul? We're servants. And again, rather than competing, what does he say? I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the growth. And he continues to refer to Apollos as our brother. And I'll just close with this. One of the benefits, and this is very secular, but to me very important, one of the benefits of having played team sports is that when you finally get together, you can only play with whoever's there. And if you played all 3 years, my frustration my senior year is that 80% of the plays we'd always been able to do, we couldn't do because these guys had graduated. You can only play with who you've got. And I think the same thing in the Lord's church. We all have different talents. We have different abilities. And when someone is better than I am in one area, rather than putting them down, let's encourage them to excel in the gift that God has, and together we can do things for God that none of us can do by ourselves. I laugh about this. I don't know of anyone that is any different than I am in temperament than Tim Lewis. We're wired different, we think different, we process different, but it is such a privilege to work together. And I think one of the things we want to do in the church, in all different levels, is that when we have someone who is gifted in different areas than we are, let's encourage them to use the gift that they had. And what did Paul say? I planted, Apollos watered, and we want God to give the growth, and we want God to get the glory for what we do in his church today.